You don't look at them as iconic characters. I mean, they refer to them as that if they become that. You're just doing a day. You're on a day-to-day, running it, having a good time, and trying to make it work.
Whether or not you're a fan of Westerns, there's every chance you've heard of the 1993 film Tombstone. The movie boasted a stellar cast, equally great acting, and went on to become one of the most quoted Western films of its era. Today, Tombstone is remembered for its performances, its dialogue, and its portrayal of historical figures like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. With how great the film turned out to be, most viewers never realized how unstable the film's production was. From studio pressure to major creative decisions being made on set rather than in pre-production, Tombstone had the potential to be a complete wreck. But somehow, it scaled through. How did this happen? And what were the challenges fans never figured out? Let's get into it. Tight schedule. Tombstone entered production at a time when Hollywood studios were competing to release similar projects as quickly as possible. In the early 1990s, two major films about Wyatt Earp were being developed at the same time. One was Wyatt Earp, a large-scale production starring Kevin Costner. The other was Tombstone, which was planned as a faster, more contained project. Thanks to this, there was a bit of a challenge. Wyatt Earp was a much larger production, meaning if it came out before Tombstone, there was a huge tendency that the film would flop. To prevent this, the studio behind Tombstone wanted their film completed and released before Wyatt Earp. It sounded like an amazing decision on paper, but in reality, it affected almost every stage of production. The schedule was tight, and the film moved forward with limited preparation time. Just like that, the goal changed from creating a prestige Western to delivering a solid, marketable film quickly. Because of this rush, parts of the script were still being revised when filming began. Some scenes had to be shortened or removed entirely to save time, and those that weren't taken out had to be adjusted on set to fit locations, weather conditions, and scheduling limits. This meant that many creative decisions were made during filming rather than in advance. Sounds awful, doesn't it? But it wasn't just the creative decisions that were affected. The compressed timeline also impacted how much authority the director had. While George P. Cosmatos was officially hired to direct the film, the constrained timeline meant the production did not operate in a traditional top-down structure. Plus, the studio was also closely involved, meaning several experienced actors were given more freedom than usual to help keep the film moving. It was all hands on deck, but some hands were more involved than others. Take Kurt Russell, for example. He played Wyatt and was the most prominent of these actors. It also helped that he had experience in Western films and had a strong working relationship with the studio. Because the project could not afford delays, his input was often accepted without formal discussion. So when scenes needed to be adjusted quickly, decisions were made on set, rather than passed through multiple layers of approval. That aside, the filming location in Arizona also added further pressure. Outdoor scenes depended on daylight and weather, leaving little room for reshoots. This required the cast and crew to work efficiently and make fast choices. Once a scene was completed, there was often no opportunity to revisit it. By the time filming ended, Tombstone had been completed largely through momentum, rather than careful planning. It was great because the film stayed on schedule. However, the process left little documentation of how many decisions were made or who made them. But it wasn't exactly all that bad, because at the time this was not considered unusual for a mid-budget studio film. Nonetheless, this working method would later become important, as cast members began to speak publicly about the production years later. It became clear that the finished film was shaped by a series of quiet, practical decisions made under pressure. These choices would go on to define the tone, pacing, and performances that audiences associate with Tombstone today. Dual directors, there's a good chance you already know what Tombstone is about, but a bit of a refresher wouldn't hurt. The film follows Wyatt Earp, a former lawman who arrives in the town of Tombstone, Arizona, hoping to live a quieter life with his brothers. That plan quickly falls apart as tensions grow between the Hers and a loosely organized group of outlaws known as the Cowboys. Violence escalates, drawing Wyatt back into law enforcement. As the conflict intensifies, Wyatt is supported by his close friend Doc Holliday, a former dentist suffering from tuberculosis. The situation reaches a turning point, with the gunfight at the OK Corral, followed by a series of retaliatory killings that push Wyatt into a personal campaign against the Cowboys. By the end of the film, Tombstone becomes less about the town itself and more about loyalty, consequence, and the cost of choosing order in a place defined by chaos. It's a brilliant storyline, reinforced with reality. To properly execute the vision, it was important for the studio to find the perfect director. Unsurprisingly, they chose George P. Cosmatos, a director renowned for films like the 1985 film Rambo: First Blood, Part 2, and Cobra the year before. Both films were enough to demonstrate his ability to deliver visually controlled, studio-driven films on tight schedules. But his stint on Tombstone wasn't exactly as mind-blowing. And here's why. Officially, George was responsible for directing the cast and shaping the final product. In fact, he's even credited as so. However, during production, the way authority worked on set did not match the formal credit. From early in filming, creative control did not operate through a single figure. Although this was not announced publicly and there was no internal statement describing a change in leadership, responsibility shifted quietly as the production moved forward. Under pressure. One of the main reasons for this shift was the film's schedule. Tombstone was being produced quickly, with little margin for delay. Scenes needed to be completed on time. Locations could not be held indefinitely. And the studio was focused on keeping the project on track. In this environment, decisions had to be made immediately, often without extended discussion. It was here that Kurt became central to this process. His involvement went beyond acting, not because he requested authority, but because the production required someone to manage problems as they arose. And since Kurt had prior experience with westerns and understood the genre's expectations, he became the go-to guy. It probably also helped that he had an established relationship with the studio, meaning his judgment was trusted. Kurt explained in later interviews that even George frequently consulted him during filming. Although he did add that these conversations were not symbolic and more so involved practical matters such as how scenes should be staged, how dialogue should be delivered, and how sequences should flow from one to the next. When changes needed to be made, Kurt was often the person making them in real time. Perhaps this was because Tombstone was George's first Western. It would also be his last. As once the project wrapped, he stuck to his action/thriller movies. This choice shaped the character's personality. Doc's humor was not played broadly. Instead, it functioned as a way to maintain composure. His wit was measured and precise, often delivered without visible effort. The humor did not distract from his condition. It existed alongside it. Val also worked closely with the script. Several cast members and later interviews have confirmed that much of Doc Holliday's dialogue was adjusted during filming. Some lines were rewritten, others shortened, and some delivered differently than originally scripted. These changes were often made on set, sometimes moments before scenes were filmed. In some cases, Val had to improvise within the structure of the scene. In others, he proposed alternative phrasing that better suited the character's tone. These adjustments were not meant to draw attention to Doc, but to keep the character consistent. The goal was clarity and restraint, rather than emphasis. One of the defining aspects of the performance is how little Doc explains himself. He rarely speaks directly about his illness, his fears, or his motivations. Instead, these elements are implied through timing, expression, and pacing. Val was actually deliberate about this approach, choosing not to make the character verbally expressive. This restraint was supported by how Doc interacted with others, especially Wyatt. Doc's loyalty is evident, but it is not dramatized. His presence is steady rather than forceful. This balance allowed the character to feel grounded even in moments of tension. Importantly, Val's role in shaping Doc Holliday was not isolated. The production environment allowed for flexibility, and changes were often accepted if they served the scene. Because the film was moving quickly, practical decisions were valued. If a line worked better when delivered differently, it was often allowed. Despite the attention Doc received from audiences, Val was not positioned as the film's central figure. The narrative remains focused on Wyatt. Doc appears when needed, supports the story, and exits without altering the film's structure, and this is part of what makes the audience's response notable. Viewers left the film discussing Doc Holliday more than expected given his role. This response was not the result of increased screen time or narrative emphasis, but of how the character was constructed. Val's performance stood out because it felt contained. The character did not compete with others for attention. He existed within the story rather than above it. This approach allowed the performance to remain consistent from beginning to end. Val has acknowledged in interviews that he viewed Doc Holliday as a man aware of his limited future. This awareness informed every choice he Made from movement to speech. This interpretation explains why the performance feels complete. Doc does not change significantly over the course of the film. Instead, he remains steady while events unfold around him. The result is a character that feels fully formed. Doc Holliday appears briefly, speaks selectively, and leaves a lasting impression. This outcome was the result of preparation, adjustment, and careful control. But it wasn't just Val who came prepared. Beyond the lead roles, several supporting actors played a significant role in shaping Tombstone's performances.